Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchanged. So, the quizzes part 1, deadline this Friday.
Right? Is it tonight or is it tomorrow?
Tomorrow.
Oh.
An extra day. Because,
Thank you.
you know, Friday night, what better way to spend Friday nights than doing epistemology quizzes? That's terrible. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, March 1st. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, April 5th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, April 26th. And these are all end of day. And then exam 5, final deadlines at the end of normal final time. For the paper, draft, April 4th. Classified deadline, April 9th. Emergency deadline, April 16th. And desperation deadline, April 26th. Before going to the new rule,
What did you say about, like, quizzes, like, do you drop the lowest grades for them or anything like that?
oh yeah, in terms of the grade breakdown, the way it works is for the quizzes, however many you take, no matter where you take them in the class, they all go into one big quiz pool. And Blackboard uses your best 10 of all of those quizzes to calculate your quiz grade. And with the exams, it's the best 4 out of all of them that counts. And of course, the paper is just the paper. And
That's
then,
bad on one of those number grades.
that's fine, because I think there's like 25 or more quizzes.
Okay, you said it takes best 10?
Yep, that's it. And you won't, it doesn't, you won't see it like marking them out or dropping them or leaving them. It will, you'll just kind of do that like in the background. So,
Okay.
So when you say quizzes part 1, you mean all the quizzes within part 1?
just, yep. Yeah, so for
like,
each,
there's 6 of them, right?
Yep. yeah, so each of the sections is a folder, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and all the quizzes in that section correspond to that part. So if you go into the folder for quizzes part 1, it'll be those. And everything's available now. You just be sure to complete them by their deadlines. And all the quizzes go in, they typically say like what they're about, and they all go in order, of the material we cover. And the same with the exams. They just cover their section, with the exception of exam 5, which covers all of the things. Okay, anything else? Okay, so last time we're looking at skepticism, which broadly speaking is the philosophical view that we don't know. And of course, clever skeptics say, we don't know that we don't know, we just don't know. And we're looking at the academic skeptics, so-called because they've taken over the academy of Plato. Now, the second of the academic skeptics was a fellow named Karnad, which sounds like somebody eats a lot of meat, perhaps. He was born 214 BC, died in 129 BC, and is of course still dead today. He was a brilliant philosopher and was sent, because of his skills, to Rome as the Athenian ambassador from 156 to 155 BC. Now back in those days, in the ancient days before Netflix and even Hulu, public philosophy was one of the entertainments. And so back in those days, if you were wandering the streets of Rome looking for amusement, you could hear philosophers out there giving these speeches. And what Karnad was famous for, he has used the famous two-faced method. Not two-faced like the Batman villain, whose one side of the face is terribly scarred, and who flips a bar of coin to make good and evil choices, but rather in this way. What he'd do is go to like a public square and deliver a brilliant, decisive speech in favor of one position. Well, for example, that one should be honest. And the next day he would come back and give an equally brilliant, convincing, decisive speech for the exact opposite, that one should lie. And this is what made him a skeptic, because he believed, going back to Pyrrho's view, that for every position you took, you can give a great argument, and you can give an equally good argument for the exact opposite position. Therefore, there's no way to know, because anything you argue for, you could always argue against equally well. Now, in addition to being a method of skepticism, this often leads, sort of, perhaps ironically, people to believe that philosophy is just opinion. Because people often take this to heart and say, hey, if you can argue really well for this, and then argue really well for the opposite, how can there be any truth? What? how can there be any point to philosophy? Now, Carnegie's point was not that philosophy is pointless, but that there's no way to know stuff, because you can never prove anything. Now, the reason why this occurred was because the skeptics had thought that the academy had lost its Socratic spirit. And again, as we saw, they pointed to his claim that wisdom is knowing you know nothing. And as we saw, the Socratic dialogues generally don't end decisively. They don't end with, oh yes, we now know exactly what justice is. But again, the idea that the academy needed to be skeptical was somewhat ironic, given that, as we saw, one of Plato's main enemies was the skeptic. So, what were their foes and why did they do what they did? Well, two of the big philosophers during this time period were the Roman Stoics and Epicureans. And they, in a way, survive to this day because we still have the term Stoic and Stoicism. So, if you are a Stoic, what sort of qualities would you have? Well, if you're a Stoic and the going gets tough,
Take charge.
yeah, you get going, because the going gets tough, the tough get going. So Stoics are people who can endure suffering and pain and so forth. We talk about someone being Stoic. We usually comment on being there enduring suffering and so forth and misfortune well. Now the Stoic had kind of interesting philosophy. The reason why they believed you should endure things is because they believed in a philosophical position called determinism. And their view was that everything that happened was in a way beyond your control. And one of their classic metaphors was this. Each of us is like a dog tied to a wagon being pulled by a mule. Now, in a contest of pulling, who's going to win, mule or dog? Yeah, the mule. So he says, basically the Stoics said you have two options. One is to be just dragged along the street, resisting the wagon. And how is that going to feel? What's it feel like being dragged by a mule wagon?
Probably not good.
Yeah, probably not a good high on list. It's not a ride at Disneyland, I'm pretty sure. But maybe it is. Who knows? And the other option is you can just kind of trot alongside the wagon and go along with it. In which case it's, you're still being pulled by the wagon, but at least it's not terrible. So their view was, life is determined. We can't, everything that happens is going to happen. And
I like the saying, like everything happens for a reason, or
yes, yeah, in a way, because everything, there's no way anything can be different. So the only thing we can control is like that dog. We can either be dragged along and be torn apart, or we can trot alongside the wagon. So our attitude is something we can control. And the Stoics, of course, believed we could know things, like very particular things like that. Now the Skeptics, of course, rejected that. The Epicureans, we still have the term today, Epicurean. It's usually a compliment. So if someone says, you're an Epicurean, they're probably praising you because it means you have really, really good taste. Now, the Epicureans themselves, they took the view that the greatest good in life is pleasure. And the idea is what you should do is seek out pleasures and avoid pains. Now, of course, they believed you could know stuff. And the Stoics, like the Stoics, you know certain things. And the Skeptics, of course, were critical of the Epicureans.
so. Were the Epicureans, were they like, did they just believe in that, or did they want you to physically go seek it out?
They wanted you to live it. I mean, they didn't, one criticism of them was what's called the pig objection, that they were accused of believing that people should just live like swine, and just, live really just hedonistic, animal-like lives.
Mm-hmm.
But Epicureans said, well, no, we don't mean that human pleasure is living like a pig, it means enjoying the finer things. It'd be like, fine music, fine literature, friendship, etc. And they advocated that, just like the Stoics said, Marcus Aurelius, probably one of the most famous Stoics, and they advocate, their kind of view is life is difficult, but you can control your attitude, so it's all, whether you're happy or miserable is all up to you. And the Epicureans said, seek out pleasure, avoid pain. And the Skeptics said, you can't know that stuff. Now, critics of Skeptics said, hey, some things we experience seem that we cannot doubt them. Because one question that we'll see throughout the course of the course, are there some things that you experience that would seem impossible to doubt? Like, for example, people have said that no one can be a skeptic when they have a really bad toothache, because the pain always, you're like, you can't just like,
You can't deny it, is that?
yeah, you can't doubt it. You're like, I'm not in pain, I'm not in pain. Now, the skeptics, of course, do have a reply to this. Their reply is that, yes, there's some impressions that we can't just make go away, but, and they always point to the dream problem and hallucinations. Namely, you can have a dream or an hallucination that feels convincing, but it's totally false. So you could be just dreaming you have a bad toothache, or you could have a hallucination. For example, one thing we know about today is what's called phantom limb pain. It became known when they were amputating people, like typically during wars. And what can happen is someone can get like their leg blown off, and they have no leg, but still they feel like pain in their leg. And clearly they don't feel pain in their leg because they don't have any leg. Now we know the physiology now, that the nerve, you know, it's sending signals back as if the leg was still there. So it's not you actually have like a ghost leg, like, which would be kind of weird. It's just that you have pain where there's, you know, nothing there anymore. And of course, people have dreams of, you know, you might have a dream you have like a toothache or your teeth are falling out or something. But of course, that's not, even though it may be scary and terrifying, not real. So the skeptics say, yeah, I mean, there's some things that seem you can't doubt them, but we've all had dreams, maybe hallucinations that seem very, very real, but clearly those things aren't real. So maybe everything we experience is not real. And again, this becomes like a standard used by skeptics up until this day.
I've heard the thing of like dreams are either like a forewarning of something coming up, or like your brain or subconscious way of telling you that something's bothering you, but like in a different way. Kind of like everyone's had that dream of like falling off the roof or something like that, but it's actually a totally different meaning than just falling off the roof. Do they believe in that, or do they believe that it actually happened?
Oh, the skeptics said, yeah, the skeptics' view is dreams aren't real, hallucinations aren't real, and we can't tell if the real world is, maybe the real world we think is real is just a dream, so maybe the supposed real world is a dream too. Now, the Greeks, like all people, did have the belief that, you know, that dreams could be foretellings, warnings, etc. But the skeptics themselves didn't typically believe, being a skeptic wouldn't entail believing that dreams did that. Being a skeptic usually means you think, well, you can't tell, you can experience dreams that seem real, so reality could just be just like a dream and not real. Apparently now they do say that dreams, one of the main functions is kind of like organizing our brain when we're asleep. It's your brain kind of putting everything together. So if you don't get enough sleep, that's why memory is all screwed up. It's like maintenance time. And they do, some people do say that people often do solve problems when they're asleep. Like you come up with answers to things. Like there are numerous famous people said like some solution to some mathematical or scientific problem came to them when they were dreaming. Which could be nice, although we probably have to do all the work ahead of time and then it just appears in the dream. So, what were their other main arguments? So you get kind of the dream argument, and then they came up with another one that becomes kind of a standard fixture to this day. It's the criterion argument. Here's the problem. Anytime you say this is true, a reasonable question is, what is the standard by which you know that it's true? To use an analogy, think about, think of like carbon dating. Carbon dating is when they take something and they use the decay rate of carbon to figure out how old it is. But a fair question is, how do you establish that carbon with that particular thing is that old? Or like with any like if you do like a medical test, how do you know the medical test is accurate? Or even something as simple as a scale. You know, like when you hop on a scale and look at your weight, in order to know if it's accurate, you would have to already know that a weight is accurate to put on that scale. Now, the skeptics point out the following problem. Any standard you use, it's always fair to ask what justifies that standard. So if you say, I know something's true because, I know this is true because I see it, then they can ask the question, how do you know that seeing it works, is accurate? And to go with metaphor, if I say, I know I weigh 175 pounds, the scale says so, a fair question to ask is, well, how do you know the scale is accurate? And if I say, well, I put this weight on it, and I put a 10-pound weight on it, and it weighs 10 pounds, they could ask, how do you know the 10-pound weight is accurate? If I say, well, I put it on another scale, and it says it's 10 pounds, they could say, how do you know that scale is good? If I say, well, I put this weight on it, yeah, they go on forever. So what they generate is what's called an infinite regress. Now, infinite regresses are bad for the following reason. They go on infinitely. So every reason, every standard you give, another standard is needed. It'd be like trying to buy something where every time you give them $1, the price then goes up $1. So it's like, you know, the price starts at $1, you give them $1, now the price is $2. So you give them $2 and the price is now $3. So you give them $3, the price is now $4. Now if that happened, would you ever be able to buy that, say, movie ticket? No, because if the price went up by $1 every time you gave them money, you'd never be able to buy it, because it'd be infinite. The ultimate cost would be infinite. And so their claim is, boiling it down is, if you come up with a standard, they'll say, how do you know that standard is true? If you say by this standard, they'll say, how do you know that standard is true? If you have another standard, they'll just say, how do you know that standard is true? Off to infinity and beyond. And so they claim, not that they know you can't know, but you can never have a standard. They can always raise the question, how do you know? So their claim is not, you know you don't know nothing. It's that you appear to lack knowledge. Because to be consistent, they can't say they know you don't know. They can only say, we don't seem to know, and so they actually suspend judgment. So they say, if you ask them, is skepticism true? They would say, which would be super annoying. Now the Stoics came back to them and said, hey, skeptics, if someone just always said, hey, I don't know, like if you ask somebody, is it lunchtime? They said, I don't know. What do you want for lunch? I don't know. Well, if they were consistent in that, would they ever eat lunch? No, because they'd never know when it was lunchtime. They'd never know what's for lunch. And so the Stoics said, if a person was a consistent skeptic, they would just do nothing. Because they would, to jokingly, they would never know when lunch was. So they would never eat lunch, and then they would die. Problem solved. Now, Karnad, confronted with this, made the classic mistake, which is compromise. He said, you can't be certain, but you can have a probability. It's probably lunchtime. Your sandwich is probably in the fridge. Or you probably shouldn't step in front of a bus because they'd probably hurt. Now, like any compromise, of course, that just annoyed everybody. And so the Stoics said, that's terrible. And the later skeptics said, that's terrible. Now, the problem with, of course, saying probability rather than certainty is that, kind of ironically, you've got to be certain about your probability. So, no solution. So Karnad probably just should have stuck with either being skeptical or dealing with probability. Then, because of that, academic skepticism went out of vogue. As mentioned before, ideally, kind of the ideal when people present about science and philosophy and stuff is that people pursue the truth, and they either get to a truth and then say, here's the truth, or they lead to a falsehood, and they say, this is not true, let us stop doing this. But in many ways, it's more like fashion, like I said. It's that it's in for a while, people do it, people are all excited about it, and then they just kind of, for whatever reason, goes out of fashion, and they move on to something else. Or something embarrassing, happens. People are like, ooh, we shouldn't do that anymore. Now, The Pyrrhonian skeptics, which were a revision of earlier skepticism, decided it was time to get the band back again for a second time, and we saw Pyrrhonian skepticism revived again. Reason, academics were not skeptical enough. So, to use an analogy with politics, it's kind of like after President Obama beat the Republicans twice, some said we got to expand the Republican Party, others said no, we've got to double down on conservatism. We're not being conservative enough. And it turned out, I guess they were right, because then Trump won. So this is kind of a similar analogy, where the Pyrrhonians said to the academics, you're not being skeptical enough. You got to double down on skepticism. And so they did. Now, not surprisingly, it's named after our good dead friend Pyrrho, and sort of oddly, they formalized skepticism. They kind of made like a rule kit for skepticism. Now, the most famous of these new Pyrrhonians is our good dead friend Agrippa. It sounds like I don't know, like a slang term for some disease or something. A terrible case of Agrippa's couldn't come to work for that. And he presented the 5 pillars of skepticism, not to be confused with the 5 pillars of Islam. And there's people like 5's good because you don't get 5 fingers, so pretty useful. Now, these pillars, essentially, we can think of more of being like walls or blocks. Essentially, these are 5 reasons they give as to why we don't know stuff. First one is this: disagreement. Not everyone will agree on an issue. Now, does that seem true? Suppose you ask people about the border wall. Does everyone agree? No. And pretty much surprisingly, almost anything you ask about, even something like waffles. Not everyone likes waffles, which is maybe concealed, but some people don't. Weird. First time I heard that, I was like, wow. Who is this person? They said they were too waffly. What does that mean? Yeah, what else would they do? You look at weird reasons for not liking. I just accept if someone doesn't like it, they give some weird reason. Now, this is true, but one obvious weak point is this: just because not everyone agrees, it hardly follows that we don't have any knowledge. If there was like if you had a math class and people were working on a test, typically not everyone gets 100, but you wouldn't say, gosh, we can't do math. You just say some people have got it wrong. So that's kind of a weak pillar. Now, a really strong pillar, and one that still keeps pillaring today, is the infinite regress. Now, in this case, their argument is similar to the standard regress, but it works like this. And regresses are pretty useful. Anytime you can kind of get an infinite regress going on somebody, you basically show them like it's an impossible situation. And they basically, unless they can stop it, they've kind of lost. So here's how this one goes. If you're going to resolve an issue, to say like, border wall is a good idea, border wall is a bad idea, you need reasons. You need reasons that can be advanced. But of course, you've got to justify your reasons. So if someone says we need a border wall to stop crime, a fair question to ask is there actually not crime, and is this an effective way to stop it? And if the person doesn't give any justification, you have no reason to believe them, because they've given you no reason. If they do give justifications, then you can question those. So if someone says, like, yes, according to Fox News, criminals are flowing across the border, terrorists. And then you'd say, well, why should we believe Fox News? And if they give a reason, you can raise a question again, what's justification for that? So every time they give a justification, you should believe this because, you can always say, why should I believe the because? And this goes on to infinity. And again, this is pretty much a death trap. Once you get into giving justifications, you're done, basically. But we'll see ways in which people try to, undone that. Now, a third pillar, which later gets, pillared some more later on, is the relativity argument. And it's a pretty good argument. Now, one thing people noted is that perceptions of the same thing differ in different situations, different circumstances. For example, a good example, very practical example is this. If you ever go to paint something, like, get like an apartment or house or whatever, one thing that people who are like, who know painting always tell you to do is you don't look at the sample just in the store, Home Depot, Lowe's, etc., because their lighting is typically fluorescent lighting, intense. Yeah, and what looks like a certain color under those conditions, you take it home, and like if you buy the paint and paint it, you may be in for a big surprise, because especially like with bathrooms. Bathrooms tend to be not like super well lit, and they're small spaces, and like a blue that looks kind of light, like in Home Depot or Lowe's, you go and paint it in that small bathroom, and you're like, wow, this is super dark, my bathroom is so, soft and scary stuff. Yeah, and so the way it looks in one lighting condition can be quite different from another. And of course, as the light changes throughout the day, it looks differently. And apparently people tell me who wear makeup, so a friend of mine had this super complicated mirror with all these different light settings. I'm like, what the hell is that for? Because I have like a mirror, so I don't cut my face when I'm shaving. That's all it does, basically. And she explained to me, like, there's different lighting situations. Like, you have like your day lighting, your club lighting, all these different scenarios. I know, so it's just what I said. It's like, how do you get anything done? All those different things. She said, it's really important. I was like, that's gotta be pretty tough. But it's true though, different things, look different under different lighting conditions. I'll give you a final example. If you ever see like, when they do sort of like on a movie, DVD or Netflix, or sometimes they have afterwards, kind of like the making of. And you'll see the stars like sitting around in their makeup and costumes, like in normal lighting, and they often look really ridiculous. The makeup is really extreme, the clothing is all super bright. But then when you see the movie, it all looks, pretty good. It all depends on the lighting. Yeah, so how we look at things vary in different situations. So in a sense, there is no such thing as the true color of the paint. It's the way it looks under particular lighting under particular conditions. And so the skeptics said, you can't know the true color of the wall because it has no true color. It all varies with the circumstances. Perception is relative. Now, of course, critics can say, yeah, it does have a real color, but it's a real color under different circumstances. So yes, it'll look different under different conditions, but you can say, like, under this condition, it looks this way. And then, of course, the skeptics say back, well, in that case, there's really still no reality to it because it's all just so relative. And so they say you can't really know. All you can say is, it looks to me like this at this time under these conditions. Fourth pillar. Now, one thing that people have tried to do to stop the regress is this. One thing that people do to end regresses is, well, it's something that was used by our good friend St. Thomas Aquinas, and also Aristotle. The idea is being, if you generate an infinite regress, and the regress itself is impossible, you can conclude there must be something that stops it. For example, here's an argument used by Aristotle for a first mover, used for Thomas Aquinas for God. Basically goes like this. Well, we'll use like a creation one. You can't get something from nothing, so now there'd be nothing. If everything had to be created by something else, we have nothing now. But do we have nothing? No, we got something. So there must be something that created everything that wasn't itself created. Otherwise, we'd have nothing. Because the infinite regress would be like, if everything has to be created by something, we'd have nothing. Because for everything you pointed to, it'd be like what atheists, atheism 101. Who created God? But the obvious reply is, well, if that argument works, everything needs creation, then there'd be nobody here to make that point. So there has to be something that created everything that was not itself created. Otherwise, it'd be nothing here. So what, in epistemology, what they try to do is a similar move. There's got to be, we do have knowledge, so there's going to be something we know for sure that grounds all our knowledge. Now, what the skeptics do, anticipating this, they say, any point you pick to say, I know this, can't be doubted, they say that those are all arbitrary. In other words, you could pick this starting point or the exact opposite. But since they're arbitrary, you can't say that they're true. So for example, as we'll see in the future, Descartes says that you know, the light of natural reason gives us that's a starting point. Others say, well, what you see with your senses, you can't doubt, or what you feel, you can't doubt. And the skeptics point out, well, here's the problem. If you just pick a point and you don't justify it, it's arbitrary. If you just say, cause, that's no proof. And if you give a reason, then you end up in the reason regress. If you say why, if you start playing the game, they just say why to that. So if you just say cause, that's not good enough. If you say cause this, they say, well, why that? And if you say that, this, they say why that, and you keep on going. So basically, no matter what. So it's a positive. The last pillar is the circular regress, which is this. They claim this is like the goalie pillar. If you somehow managed to do the seemingly impossible and get past the other four pillars, you'd end up with what's called circular reasoning. It would just assume what has to be proven. So if someone just says, well, we do know, because we know, they would say, well, saying we know because we know just runs us in a circle. Now, we'll see in the future, a fellow, Chisholm, I think he's dead. He was alive a while ago. I think I looked it up last year. I think he's like dead, not super dead. He's not been in a long time, so he's just dead, not like super dead. But he argued that we do have to beg the question. That's the only way to do it, but it's okay. And the skeptics would say that's not okay. So those are the five pillars. So are they right? Are we doomed? That's a pretty clever dude. Now, later skeptics came along and said, 5 is too much. Let's work that down to 2. So they had 2 theses. One is this. First, they argued or claimed nothing is self-evident. So there's nothing that you just get the truth. You know, Plato claimed that we just saw the truth of the forms. And then we'll see in the future, there are people like Descartes and Locke, also the founding fathers, said, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And the skeptics said, nothing is that. Nothing is self-evident. Then they also contended that nothing can be proven. So if nothing is self-evident and nothing can be proven, then you can know nothing. So they believe it takes care of all of that. Now, they're in kind of a pretty good position because if you argue that, you know, against them, that nothing is self-evident, then the question is, well, how would you prove that? And if you argue that you can prove things, well, how do you prove that? So, yeah, it's a tough thing to beat. Now, a good question, of course, is, as a practical point, so what do you do with the skepticism stuff, once it's been argued for? Now, as selling points, the skeptics offered us this. First, they claimed they would give you personal peace. Not like a personal pizza, but personal peace. I guess it's like a small piece. You know? And it's kind of like the song, you know, don't worry, be happy. Because if you don't know, you have no reason to worry. Socrates, in a way, kind of gave this argument in the Apology. He said, I don't know what death is going to be like. He says people are afraid of death, but I don't know if it's going to be good or bad, so why worry about it? It's kind of like the attitude of well, like in the Lion King, like Pumbaa and the, what was the other one? Timon, thank you. And they, you know, the song, you know, yeah, the idea being that you don't know what's going to happen, so don't worry about it. Just be happy until that lion comes along and straight up. Of course, it's a good line. You know, a non-murderous line. They're lucky. They're very lucky. Yeah. So the idea is kind of basically, you might have a friend who's kind of that view. They just don't worry about anything because they just say, I don't know. You know, maybe I'll have my rent, maybe I won't. I'm just not going to worry about it. And you know they'll be asking you for that money. That's how they get their rent. Yeah, so that's kind of their view. You don't know, so why worry? Does that work though?
No.
Typically not.
That would be like the point of stress, is because you don't know what that would set you back, doesn't it?
Yeah, true, because, in many cases the opposite is because you didn't know, it's like, if you know you've got your rent all paid for, and you've got health insurance and everything, you're like, I'm not worried, but sort of like, I don't know where it's coming from, I don't know what this month on my arm is, and worries. Yeah, so maybe they're exactly wrong. So, going back to the ethics thing, so if you can't know about, you know, right and wrong, they offer the same thing the earlier skeptics did. Namely, when it comes to custom and law, just go along. Because you can't know, you know, if it's good or bad, just go along. Now, is that good advice?
No.
No, probably not, because the customs and laws could be terrible. Now, it's okay if you're, I guess, if you're at the top of the pyramid, then it's fine. But if it's not that great, then getting along is not a great idea. So, yeah, not so great. Now, not surprisingly, this led to skepticism's downfall. So why did skepticism not become like a dominant thing? Again, for a while it was really popular. There were like lots of skeptics, people skepticizing and stuff. Now, one of the problems we ran into was this. Even though a skeptic can always bring up like a problem, like infinite regress, etc., one sort of irony is that to argue like that infinite regresses are bad, they've got to kind of assume that like logic works and infinite regresses are bad. Because if you really wanted to be obnoxious, you could say to them, well, how do I know infinite regresses are bad? Maybe I just do have knowledge. So if they're going to make their argument, they've got to have a starting point. They've got to use logic and premises and infinite regresses, etc. And that implies that they have reasons for believing their arguments. Because if you want to be skeptical about the skeptics, you could do that too. And just say, hey, I know stuff, prove that I don't. And they'd be like, hey, that's not fair. You'd say, exactly. Now, despite this, why do skeptics deserve some praise? Well, they did prove useful. First, skeptics are good in a practical sense because if you have a good skeptic, not an annoying one, they make you more critical. So from the standpoint of philosophy, having like worthy opponents made philosophers more critical because you just couldn't say stuff. You have to, fight against these skeptics. Now, looked at pragmatically, it's also useful. For example, one of the things they talk about in politics is if you have a president who all their advisors just agree with them and never challenge them, they're going to come up with lots of bad ideas and never get questioned. So as a practical matter, it's good to have doubt because not all ideas are good. So philosophers had to either accept these skeptical arguments or refute them. So philosophers had to up their game. Example of this was St. Augustine. He wrote against the academics. As we'll see, look at our good dead friend Descartes. During the modern era, basically 1400 to 1899, philosophers adopted it as a method. And we'll look at our good dead friend Descartes, who tries to use skepticism, ironically, to beat skepticism. It's kind of like the old saying, only a ninja can beat a ninja. Only a skeptic, I guess, can be a skeptic. Not true, but good move. Also, interestingly, as I mentioned before, one thing you can do, since during the time period, like around the modern era, atheist arguments were starting to come up. People like David Hume, etc., were advancing arguments, that God probably doesn't exist. And as religion came under attack by reason and logic, sort of ironically, skepticism became a very good defense mechanism. Well, if you could raise skeptical doubts about reason, about philosophical arguments against God, you left room for faith and revelation. So if you can say there's no way to know that God doesn't exist, and no way to know that he does through reason, well, that opens the door to faith and revelation. So sort of oddly, skepticism can provide a path to faith. Because the skeptical attacks, as we saw, are pretty much all on reason. You can't know this because, proofs, etc. But if you can show that reason can't disprove God, or prove it, then you say, well, you can believe based on faith or direct revelation. Also, interestingly, even although it helped make the world safe for faith, it also helped with the development of science as well. And of course, a key part of the scientific method is being skeptical, requiring proof. So it did a lot of stuff. The why did not catch on. Well, here are the main reasons why it fell out of favor. First, as has been noted, it didn't really succeed in creating peace. As I said, if you don't know stuff, you tend to worry, more. And at first, it may seem kind of like, you could try this yourself. Like, you could be like, if you're in a bad situation, you just say, well, I don't know if this is really, really happening. Well, that's not super useful. Like at the dentist, no one would say to the dentist, don't bother with the Novocaine. I don't know if this is really happening or not, but not really worried. Now, instead of creating peace, it generally created confusion. And people found it largely unsatisfactory as a way of life. Also, of course, during the time period with skepticism and skepticizing, there was the rise of Christianity. And Christianity, instead of saying, you can't know stuff, it said, believe this stuff, you get, heaven. And so it was sort of outcompeted by Christianity. And so, whereas Christianity is a big faith today, skepticism is not a big faith today.
So does that, I guess I don't know how to phrase my question, but since there's these philosophical theories, skepticism, the other ones, right? Currently today, would you say that we don't have any of those philosophical ideas, we're more like a religious kind of society, right?
I would say, yeah, the dominant view in the United States is Christianity. Yeah, would be, Christianity broadly construed is kind of the major view. And as far as there being there are political, people have philosophy-ish views. For example, if someone's a liberal, they would have a liberal political philosophy, kind of. But as far as people having fully developed philosophies, mostly that would be just professional, academics. It's rare for non-professionals to have developed philosophical views. So if you get in if you do know political philosophy, you get a political debate with someone, you'll see that typically they don't have a consistent, philosophy of politics. They have kind of a bag of whatever they picked up in life, and they don't all fit together, which can be unfortunate. This is my own bias, but I think if people had more consistent philosophical views and worked at putting together kind of a basic view of the world, maybe they would have more consistent viewpoints. Now, some people do. For example, people you may like, people may hate, do have philosophical views. Paul Ryan, for example, he's a philosophical guy. He believed in, accepted on Ron's philosophical view. He quotes, Aquinas and stuff. He's got a philosophical system, but now he's gone. other, like some Democrats have a consistent philosophical system. President Obama seemed to have a you know, he's a pretty smart guy, you know, did a lot of law, knows philosophy and stuff, so he had a pretty consistent view. But most politicians, their philosophy is mostly, I want to be in office type of deal. But maybe I'm, you know, getting people wrong. Maybe we'll do have more consistent philosophies. I do know that when I try to talk philosophy to people, they get really annoyed really quickly because they think I'm trying to attack them, as opposed to discussing their. Because I always say I'm discussing the view, I'm not attacking the person. And then one of the key things about doing philosophy is being able to separate a person's view, like the concept, from the person. You know, I know plenty of philosophers whose views I disagree with completely, but I like the person, because the view, unless they're Nazis, is not the person. Yeah, good point. And most people do have religions, but most people don't have like a developed philosophy. But interestingly, most people don't have a developed religion. Like, because religion's not really my specialty, but I'm in the philosophy and religion department, I study religions, and I'll discuss with people who claim to be very religious, and I'll ask them their views on like the soul and the ethics of religion, and they're like, I just go to church. I go to church once a week, maybe on Christmas. I'm like, okay.
I find that like people, my peer group as well, they're just like everyone really has to have a philosophical idea. It's just like they have their religion that they believe in, and then like from there, that's how like people believe in it.
Yeah.
It's interesting that back then people were like, I'm a philosopher, I believe this, I believe this, I believe that.
Yeah, because they had no Netflix back then. So
Oh, you just I didn't have to think about stuff. Okay.
yeah, so that was the entertainment, and you know, even actually in the United States, interestingly, before we had like television and stuff, I don't want to knock television and stuff, but philosophy was actually pretty popular in America, and in small towns, like, and also the arts, small towns that put on productions of Shakespeare, and because people had to make their own entertainment, and the only things that you had were like books and songs, and yeah, at one point, kind of intellectual life was a big thing. It was like like for example, if you read letters written during like the Civil War and Revolutionary War, they're really, part of it is kind of like a bias, because people who write them tend to be educated, but people would write, you know, these very eloquent, informed letters, and they'd be, you know, making references to like the Odyssey and the Iliad and so forth, because then you just had books, you know. Yeah. So I'm not sure if it's worse, but I mean, we are in different times, and every generation thinks the next generation is terrible. Ever since Socrates was talking about in his time, the youth, you know, were terrible, and they didn't respect their elders, and they were just spending all their time with these newfangled, you know, papyrus scrolls, and, you know, they're terrible. So everything said about any generation, people have been saying forever. For every generation, the next generation is terrible. And just in different ways. Yeah, but I think it would be useful if people knew more stuff. Or maybe it'd be terrible. Maybe people would be like, maybe the people would like really get into things, and it'd be horrible. You know, it's like let's go back to watching Netflix. Thank God for Netflix. Now, so one question is, can you ever beat the skeptic? Now, the answer would seem to be no. Why not? Well, as we saw, the philosophical position of skepticism is we don't know stuff. And this is defined by how far the doubt goes. So the question would be, can we ever know? And the answer would seem to be no. And we can take all our skepticism and kind of boil it down to this meta argument. Now, to know something, generically speaking, we're going to have two things going on. One, it's got to be true. And secondly, we've got to justify it. And as we've seen, no matter what justification we give, there's always the question of what justifies the justification. It's kind of like the question, you know, who washes the washers. Now, if we justify that standard, then the question arises again. And if we answer that question, it just keeps arising. It's kind of like the problem of, you know, if you're gonna have ethical oversight over people, like suppose you want to say, someone needs to watch people in Congress so they don't do sketchy stuff. Okay, let's appoint a board of Congress watchers. Then you have like this big scandal and the Congress watchers are corrupted. You say, okay, we need people to watch the Congress watchers. So you have the Congress watching watchers. And then there's another scandal, so then what do you do? Because, well, if you just keep giving more watchers, they're just gonna keep getting more corrupted. And if you just say, okay, let's go with this group, that group's just gonna get corrupted. So either way, you'll have no way to justify the standard. So the skeptic seems they're always gonna be right. No one justifies the justifiers, no one can watch the watchers. Now, the usual counter is you need something like self-justifying. So one thing people propose, to use the political analogy, when people run for office, they'll often say, you know, those other people are corrupt, vote for me because I am, I'm not corrupt, I'm incorruptible. Like when Donald Trump was running, people made the argument, since he was already a billionaire, maybe, I don't know, no tax returns, that he couldn't be bought. The idea being that if you're rich, you can't be bought by money. Which of course is a terrible argument because you always want more, there's always more. Unless you have all the money, you want more money. So one reply would be, okay, you get a standard that's self-justifying. You know, again, to use my metaphor, you have the incorruptible congressperson. Now the obvious reply is, as we saw, people come up with all these different self-justifying standards. And these sometimes contradict each other. So at least one of them is going to be wrong, possibly all of them. Now, given this plethora of standards, we got to pick one that's right. Because people come up with all kinds of, as we'll see in the future, all kinds of different ones. If we pick between them, if we're doing it with a standard, then a fair question to ask is, well, what's the basis for your standard? So again, if politicians say, no, but pick me, I'm incorruptible. No, pick me, I'm incorruptible. Well, if you use a standard, the question is, well, how do you know what's incorruptible? What's the standard? Now, if you don't have any standard at all, then any one of them would do. So none of them, pick any one of them, but we know at least one of them's got to be wrong. And so you end up with this like nightmare scenario, worse than skepticism. So it seemed that a skeptic cannot be beaten. Now, the second sort of path of argument we've seen is this. For any argument you give, you can always give a counter argument. And as I mentioned before, like when I drop my friends not so on philosophers because they'll ask me what I think about something, and they want a definite answer. They just want, this is the right answer. And I annoy the hell out of them because I'll say, well, here are the reasons for this position, here are the reasons for that position. And by the time I get to like the second position, they're done. They wanted like a definitive answer. And they'll say, let's just watch Netflix or something. So their usual criticism is, well, there is no answer because you can argue for any side. Now, if you push that, of course, you end up with the problem we saw, namely, any argument you give, you can always argue against that. So if you say, like, for example, oh, I know this is real because it seems so consistent. They can say, well, you can have a dream that seems so consistent. Well, it can't be consistent as this. Well, why can't it be? So you can argue forever. And you can build skeptical arguments that are based on the same thing that non-skeptical arguments are based on. So you can sort of like use a non-skeptical, it's like using their own weapons against them. Now, the usual counter to this is finding an infallible source of knowledge. So, for example, occasionally people want to debate with me about religion, and I always warn them, I say, you don't want to start this. They're like, why? I'm like, I do this professionally, I've done this for decades. This is not a good idea. And then I kind of push it. I'll keep warning them, like, I'm not gonna do this. I mean, it's kind of like no one would go up to like, Chuck Norris and say, hey, let's punch around a little bit, and no one would go to like Usain Bolt and say, hey, let's go race. And I heard people was like, I'm a professional philosopher. Like, oh, philosophy is just BS. You can just argue, and then it's in tears. It's very sad. Now I don't know if they argue. And so people say, well, I just know. And then I'll just say, well, what's the evidence for this? What are the reasons? And then it goes, you know, like, oh my God, God is dead, life is empty. I'm like, no, let's have some cake. It's okay. Now, the problem with claiming an infallible source is this. Obviously, how do you know it's infallible? When people just say, I just know, well, you can just say back to them, it's like when you have arguments about faith. Like when someone says, well, like someone might say, the Mormons are wrong. And then someone might say, well, how do you know they're wrong? Well, I feel that they're wrong. Well, how do you think they feel about their faith? And they're like, well, they probably believe it. I'm like, yeah, they probably believe it pretty strongly. So how do you know you're right? I'm like, oh no, God is dead. Now, so if you claim self-evident infallibility, you just like see the truth somehow. Now, then again, you run into that regress problem. How do you know it's self-evident? And of course, you can also point out to, again, using the example of religion, people will say, well, I know my religion is true. And I'll point out, well, what about the people in ancient Greece, or ancient Mesopotamia, or ancient Egypt? Were they all just lying? Just like all like, yeah, we believe in Ra. You know, no, I'm sure they were very sincere. They were just as sincere as we were. So we just go by our sincerity of belief. That's not good enough because people who believe in Zeus and Ra and so forth, or even today, if someone is a devout Christian, there are people who are Hindus and Buddhists and Mormons and other sects of Christianity who have different views. They're just as sincere. So if you go by sincerity, then everybody would be, either everyone else is lying and just pretending, or everyone is right, which they can't be. So you end up with this, you know, infinite regress problem. Now, what more recently people have done is this. They said, they realized that trying to like engage the skeptic in argument that way is basically a losing battle, because you can just run those arguments. And it's like someone sticking their face into a buzzsaw. It's just that's not gonna work. Or it's like hoping, you know, it's like someone saying, you know, I think I'm doing a lot of damage to their hands by hitting their hands with my face. It's not gonna work. So more recently, people have tried 3 tactics. One is pragmatic grounds, the pragmatic argument, that simply, as a matter of practicality, we know stuff. So normally this is the view we'll see when we look at our good dear friend John Locke. One way to kind of try to be the skeptic is saying this. It's what I now call like the video game approach. Now, if you play video games, you know they're video games. It's not real. So if you're playing like World of Warcraft or Warframe or Call of Duty or the upcoming game Anthem, which I hope is not going to suck. Please don't suck. Although I have no faith anymore in that regard. If you're playing the game, you know it's not real. But of course, if you're playing to enjoy it, you're not going to stand your character in the fire because you just die. It's like, Dave, stop standing in the fire. And you know it's not real fire because it's a video game. But if you stand and you keep dying, your game is going to be pretty unpleasant because you're going to be just dead all the time. And so you could say pragmatically in life, I don't know if like fire in life is real, but I do know if I stand in it, that it like hurts me and stuff. So I'm not going to do that. Likewise, I don't know if buses are real or like roofs are real, but I get that if I fall off them, then I get pain. Maybe it's not real pain, but it hurts. I want to avoid that. So you could say, don't be a skeptic because you can't know stuff, sure, but you have enough information to be aware of playing the game. So you may say, I don't know if the fire is real, but you're not going to put your hand in it. So that's basically Locke's approach. Now that is a lot of appeal. I actually kind of like that. Second one is the evolutionary approach. Evolution is the idea, of course, that there's you have genes, and then you have natural selection. Things that don't do well, they die. Things that do well reproduce, make more of their kind. And so the claim is that we've been naturally selected for creatures that get things right. Because we didn't get things right, we die. Now, of course, even though people really like evolution, it's used kind of like magic now. They use it for all kinds of stuff, some pretty terrible stuff too. That's not a very good solution. Why? Because the skeptic will just say, how do you know there's anything to evolve? How do you know there's any of this evolution stuff? Because it already presupposes all kinds of knowledge. So this is kind of like saying, let us assume we know all kinds of stuff, like all about evolution and biology and genetics and natural selection and so forth. Then don't we know things? It's like, yes. Yes, we do. It's like saying, let us assume I'm completely right about all this stuff. Am I right about some stuff? Yes. Yes, you are. So that, in a way, kind of like assumes way too much. Maybe true, but assumes way too much. A third option is just saying, you're going back to the circular thing, just saying, this is Chisholm's approach, just saying, we know things. Screw you, skeptic, I know things. Now, one way to look at that, that could be fair, because the skeptic is just saying, hey, you know, you don't know anything, and here's my reasons. And someone could say back, well, I do know things. And if the skeptic engages in a way, they're kind of falling into a trap too, because if they start arguing with you, they have to accept that argumentation like works. So to even talk to you, they've got to be assuming some things. So it is kind of fair to point out, maybe the skeptic is kind of cheating, because they're setting it up, you know, see, there's no way you can win, and they're assuming unless you can prove for sure you don't know. Whereas the alternative view is to kind of flip the burden of proof, to say, hey, unless you can prove that I don't know stuff, I do know stuff. You know, this is my hand, fire burns, I know all this stuff. You gotta show me I'm wrong. Which is a fair point. So how do we beat all these? Well, again, there's a point made by Chisholm, and critics say that just begs the question. To say that we know stuff assumes we know. And again, kind of the battle there is one of intuitions. You know, is the skeptic cheating, or is it cheating, you know, by their approach, or is it a cheat to say we do know stuff? And on different days, like usually on Tuesdays, I think that's probably okay, and Wednesdays not so much. Saturdays, I don't think about it. Now again, the problem with the evolutionary approach is, again, first, we have to justify, you know, that evolution produced beings that know stuff. We have to either appeal to evolution again, how we know this, or if we appeal to something else, then we just abandon the evolutionary theory. Same problem with a pragmatic answer. Maybe just say, well, pragmatic things are true because they're pragmatically useful. And then you say, well, why? They say because they're useful, runs in a circle. Or if you give another reason it's not pragmatic, then you're giving another reason, you're abandoning pragmatism. So it would seem the only way to break the skeptic is just to assume they're wrong, which seems to be certain. So the end result seems to be that the skeptic is, just like the Bruce Willis film, is unbreakable. Now, so then, if we're stuck with skepticism, like a dead albatross, like in the Rime of Ancient Merriment, is there any reason to think that that's not terrible? Well, fortunately, we can make the argument that skepticism can still be useful. Now, of course, this assumes that there's like a role for the useful end, but here's an appeal to the value of extreme skepticism. So, what is extreme skepticism? Well, Socrates, of course, claimed the only thing he knew was he knew nothing. And Descartes went on to pretty extreme doubt. Namely, he doubted anything but in his own existence, as we'll see. And of course, you can push it even further and just doubt everything. Total 100%, 1,000,000% skepticism. Now, if they're making stuff up, why not just make everything up? Now, interestingly, despite the fact that skepticism has never really tasted defeat in terms of being like decisively beaten logically, it's a matter of like facts. Like I said, it's normally like you had this ideal of that when I was young and foolish, not old and foolish. I had the view that academics was, you know, they would solve, get to truths, and everything was done based on, you know, truth. And then my advisor was like, yeah, basically we work on stuff until it goes out of fashion, and we just move on to something else. And I was like, I'm so disappointed. It was like, I was really disillusioned. Like, I'm like, so disappointed. It's like finding out what's in hot dogs. You're like, oh my God. Yeah, they don't think about it. So skepticism fell on hard times. Namely, not because it's been defeated, but because people just kind of rejected it on the grounds, typically pragmatic grounds, that it's useless. It went out of fashion. It's kind of like, I was going to use the example of Crocs, but they actually are terrible. It's like just certain clothing styles go out. There's nothing wrong with the style. It just goes out of fashion. People just stop doing it, even if it's like a really good style, and then it might come back later. Now, the position taken here is that even extreme skepticism is defensible and useful. So if you want to be pragmatic and use that avenue, skepticism is still a good thing, as Martha Stewart would say before she went to prison. Which she did, insider trading. He's a hardened convict. And she made these very fancy shanks. She would be very polite about shanking people. She'd send them a little invitation to a shanking. Because, just because one is a cold murderer doesn't mean one can't be polite. Martha Stewart. Now, the shanking's probably not true. Or is it? Now, doubt, as we've seen, is really easy to bring about. It's really easy to run skepticism. How so? Well, we can take like something like the senses. Sort of at the start of the day, pretty much people tend to believe in their senses. Seeing is believing. But as our good dead friend Descartes will show, it's real easy to show we can't trust them. For example, we have all those classical optical illusions. Some are ones we experience in things of life, like the straw and the water, the heat mirages on the road, railroad tracks meeting, and the ones, of course, that they put on, the more artistic ones, like the ones with you stare at like black squares on white paper for a long time, and you see like the after images. And the ones with like length and size, there are entire books, pictures of these illusions. And then of course we have experiences where our senses deceive us in non-optical illusions. For like you think you see your friend, walking with you, you're yelling to him, you're yelling and yelling to them, and you're like, wait, that's not my friend. Or you think it's like your car, and you're like trying to, why won't it open? And you're like, oh, not my car, it doesn't look like my car. Yeah, so we can easily be deceived in looking at things. So the obvious question is, given all the possibility for illusion and mistake, how can we trust our senses now? Now, we might assume that while our senses sometimes fail, they work most of the time. Then the question would be, can we be confident? How do we know they're not failing us now? And so, just by simple examples of everyday life, it's really easy to generate doubt about our senses. We can use another examples like magic tricks. They're all basically sensory. There's no real magic. Except for people who have sold out to the devil for different things. Other minds. We know, in my own case, I know I've got thoughts and feelings, but how do you know other people have thoughts and feelings? Well, you may think, well, surely they do. But think about other people. When they say things to you, are they really telling you the truth? When someone says they love you forever, are they lying? Are they not? And you have no way of knowing. Because no matter how much, you look at them, you can't tell what they're really thinking. You never know what's behind those eyes. Because, everyone's been, people lie to them, been betrayed, and often you don't know until they betray you. So you have no idea what other people are thinking or feeling. And so you really have no idea if they even think or feel at all. So it's pretty easy to get from, you don't know exactly what the people are thinking, to doubts about other minds. And then, of course, you can do the same thing with the external world. This could all be a dream. This could all be, Elon Musk claims, like a virtual reality. He claims that. I don't know how serious he is, but he claims that. One of the arguments for it is really, it's a terrible argument, but they advance like it's good. The idea is this. there could be billions upon billions of simulations. If there are billions of simulations, then statistically speaking, it's more likely we're in a simulation in the real world. Therefore, we're probably in a simulation. And of course, the argument is fundamentally flawed because we don't know we don't know if there are billions of simulations, so that argument. But that's the claim. But we could be in virtual reality. We don't know. This could be the work of the evil demon. This could be, just put in your favorite sci-fi, Black Mirror, Twilight Zone, Outer Limits episode, choice. And so it's easy to cast doubt on even our common sense view, that our senses work, that other people have thoughts and feelings, that there's an external world. So skepticism is super easy. The things people feel most confident in, it's easy just through a couple steps, reasonable steps, getting them to doubt stuff. Because everybody has to accept, yeah, my senses don't always work. And people say, yeah, I don't always know what other people are thinking. I don't know if they're telling me the truth. So, yeah, maybe this is a dream. So why then would this be a good thing? It seems like it's terrible leading people into some type of psychosis. Well, here's why it can be good. While it's easy to get people to doubt about senses and other minds, etc., many people have no doubt about their, say, big-scale beliefs, about their views about politics or economics, race, sex, gender, etc. Now, most of the time what we do is harmless, most unfortunately, or even beneficial. But sometimes things are very, very harmful. Think of the people who shot up, the person who shot up the church, racist, person who shot up the synagogue, racist, person who shot up, the incel people who killed women, sexist. And so we have people who have views about gender and race and religion and so forth, who do terrible things because of their belief systems, their racist beliefs, their sexist beliefs, their political religious beliefs. And these lead to terrible, terrible consequences. Now, since people are conditioned to believe in things uncritically, that's the whole point of education, actually, people are easy to sway in different ways. People will chant, lock her up, build a wall, single-payer healthcare, whatever you want them to chant, they'll just kind of chant. So how can skepticism maybe help here? Well, doubt can be a terrible thing, but can also be a good thing. Because if you have doubts about your belief, there are some advantages. Namely, to the degree someone has doubts, honest doubts, they may be less inclined to do extreme or terrible things. Because if you're doing something that requires, it's extreme or terrible, and you think maybe I'm wrong, you might be less inclined to do it. Because they could be wrong, and so people who think they could be wrong tend to be more moderate about it, as opposed to people who are absolutely certain. Now this is clearly not infallible, because sometimes doubt causes people to double down. So one terrifying thing about doubt is, they found that with some political, medical beliefs, etc., if you provide people with clear evidence for something that goes against their belief, sometimes they actually double down on their belief. There are people who are, for example, who are anti-vaccination, and if you show them that these studies supposedly showing vaccines are dangerous is totally debunked, and that the risk of getting measles is vastly higher than the risk of side effects, they'll double down. They'll make them believe it more, which seems insane. Yeah, so this can be a problem. But in general, just like medicine can have negative side effects, doubt generally is more curative than harmful. And skepticism, of course, is a tool for creating doubt. Because if a person realizes that something like reality itself can be doubted, then hopefully they'd be more willing to doubt extreme political views, etc., and say maybe I'm wrong about my racism or wrong about my sexism. And so the study of philosophy can, in theory, help with this by generating a degree of doubt. So someone could say maybe there's no external world. They also might say maybe my view about racism is mistaken, or my view about gender gender views as well. Or at least it gets people habituated to asking questions. Could I be wrong about this? Again, it's not infallible, but maybe it could help. Okay, so see, our time is up. So end of part one, perfect time. So have a good rest of the week, and I'll see you on the Tuesday.